Go ahead and call me a blind fanboy, because you're not wrong. I'm legally blind, and I'm a big fan of this new Mac Mini with M1. I've been using it for the past 3 months, and it's been my daily computer, replacing a 5K 27-inch iMac that I've used for the last 5 years. Let's talk about the experience moving from Intel processors to Apple's own silicon. So as I said, I came from a 27-inch 5K iMac that I've been using since 2016. It was the late 2015 model, but it got the job done. Everything from editing in Final Cut Pro to just browsing the web, doing some light gaming on it. It was a great machine. If you like the contents of this video, be sure to hit the like button, let me know in those comments, and if you're not subscribed, just so you know, I make videos about technology and experiences from the perspective of being legally blind. My initial jump from Windows to Mac was back in 2009 when my parents got me a MacBook Pro 15-inch. And this was really to pursue video editing, learning video creation, and actually have a computer that was visually accessible for me out of the box. That last part is very important to note because, again, this is my opinion, this is from my experience and impressions of the Mac Mini M1 and just in general the Mac ecosystem. It's been accessible for me out of the box. Everyone's gonna have different experiences or preferences with, especially if they need accessibility, and that's totally okay, and I respect that. For me, I've given Windows plenty of tries, and in fact, the last time I used Windows was literally back in October, and I tried using the accessibility available in Windows, and it was a very horrific experience. And if you say it's because, well, you didn't, get the hardware that's up to par with, your Mac, right? The display, or you didn't get a good enough, whatever it might be. No, I was running Windows on my Mac. And again, Windows was running fine. It's just the accessibility offerings built in just don't do it for me. There's something that really does excite me, though, about Apple going with their own silicon, and I'll talk about that in just a bit here. But it really has me excited for the future of accessibility on the Mac. The chips in a lot of the computers that we all use are from companies such as Intel, possibly AMD, maybe Nvidia, or Qualcomm. But Apple has decided they can do it themselves. They don't need Intel anymore. They've been using Intel since about 2005, which is quite a while. So that's why Macs have been able to actually use Boot Camp. Boot Camp is essentially a way that you can install other operating systems like Windows on your Mac and boot it up natively. It's because it's running an architecture that is very similar to what's on a Windows computer. Now, Apple is going about making their own chips, and they've been making their own chips since the iPhone 4 and the original iPad. People have speculated for the last few years that Apple would go about making their own chips on the Macs, which it's finally here, and it is quite an impression. I'm not the best when it comes to giving a more technical answer for this, but the reason why Apple probably didn't have chips available right away for Mac and why it took a while was really because macOS, the operating system, the software in your Mac, is built on a foundation that really started in the 90s. macOS 10 has been around for over a decade, and now macOS Big Sur is technically 11.0. It's macOS 11. It's just called macOS though. What really is the M1? The M1 is, again, a chip that is built by Apple, not by Intel, and it's built on a foundation similar to what you would have on an iPad Pro. And people know that the iPad Pros are powerful. In fact, they're extremely powerful. In fact, I don't think all their power has been tapped into by the iPad itself. Now, although the iPhone and the iPad are running the A series chips like the A12X and the A13 and the A14 as of recent, this is using the M series, which I think it's just to help differentiate the two, especially for marketing purposes. It's a pretty powerful chip. You have an 8-core CPU, an 8-core GPU, a 12-core neural engine, I think. Hey, post-production James here. Just to correct, it's not a 12-core neural engine. It's actually a 16-core neural engine, so that's even better than what I was selling it to be. Anyway, back to your featured presentation. Also known as RAM, is also unified. It's all on the same board with all of these cores. What this means is the RAM can be shared amongst all the cores, including CPU and GPU, from the same unified RAM, and it's a bit more faster and efficient than you'll find on other computers. At the time of recording this video, there are only 3 Macs that have the Apple Silicon, or M1, in this scenario, and that is the MacBook Air, the entry-level MacBook Pro, 13-inch, and the Mac Mini. The Mac Mini is the most affordable of all of them, starting at only $699 here in the US. But keep in mind, when you buy a Mac Mini, you're only buying a Mac Mini. You simply just get the computer, the power cord, and the idea is that you bring your own keyboard, mouse, or trackpad in my scenario, and monitor, which is important. Unless you're totally blind, maybe you don't need that monitor. The cool thing is though, the Mac Mini actually has a speaker. It's a mono speaker and it's not impressive by any means, but it's there. And I think it's really there to really help someone who is maybe using something like VoiceOver, who could be totally blind and trying to set up a computer without a monitor or without a speaker headset of their own. I've actually seen some reviewers kind of knock the Mac Mini for even having a speaker and just like wondering what's the point. Believe it or not, people are totally blind. People have no sight and can still use a computer because software is cool. Later in this video, I'll be talking about my accessibility features that I use because people asked me about that. They wanted to know what current settings am I using on my machine to be as efficient and visually accessible as possible. The Mac Mini, in comparison to the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, has the most I/O ports, which is very nice for me as I do a lot of video editing. The one thing I don't have though is my SD card slot. I really wish that was present. What you will have though in terms of your I/O ports are 2 USB-A's, so the rectangular USB. You'll also have a headphone jack, or 3.5mm. You'll have HDMI, so if you want to plug in a monitor. You'll have 2 Thunderbolt 3/USB Type-C ports. You'll have your Ethernet port right here, and it's not 10 gigabit Ethernet, it's just gigabit Ethernet. Power button will be on the side here as well. And the speaker is probably in this area as well, this kind of open slot, which this is really for the fan to blow through, but you should hear the speaker through that as well. So those are the I/O ports. It's not the most impressive to today's computer standards, but you can expand those with other hubs, which I personally do when I need more ports or my beloved SD card slot. So although the Apple M1 chip is fast, it's powerful, it's efficient, it's not perfect, and there are some things you should be aware of if you are planning to upgrade or possibly even downgrade to this computer or any computer that has M1. For the few of you that do want to connect more than one display to your Mac, say 2 displays, maybe even more, well, you're capped at 2, and that's only for the Mac Mini, because the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro with the M1 can only connect to 1 display. And that's because this thing has native HDMI. So one display has to be HDMI while the other display goes into either one of the Thunderbolt ports. For the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, they only have 2 Thunderbolt ports. That's it. You only have the option to have 2 Thunderbolt ports on any of the Macs with M1 at this time. And because of that, you can only put in 1 display. You can't put in 2 Thunderbolt displays, just 1. And you can use an adapter to plug in an HDMI, but again, it's only going to send video signal to 1 display. Now, something to keep in mind is if you rely on Windows or any other operating system that you also run on your Mac, so specifically you rely on Boot Camp or Parallels or VMware Fusion, it's not going to work, at least not right now. Now, Parallels and VMware Fusion are third-party softwares that emulate operating systems natively within the OS of your Mac. They're being worked on to work with Apple Silicon natively, but as of right now, they're really just in beta, and I don't even know if it's a public or open beta. Boot Camp, which was a native feature that Apple made themselves, that helped run things like Windows natively on your Mac to, partition your hard drive and let you run 2 OSs at once. It was cool. It was a nice feature having it there, but it's not going to work anymore. So if you do rely on something like Windows for work or school or whatever it might be, or you really like having that feature, maybe you do gaming and you game off your Mac with Windows, this ain't going to do it for you, Chief. Another thing to keep in mind that kind of goes with the whole Boot Camp is that not every app is going to work with this Mac. Many will, and many will maybe have some broken features, so just keep this in mind. So if you really do rely on some third-party software for your workflow or work, just make sure you've looked up to see if they offer either a universal app or an app that works with Apple Silicon. This is important because Apple did try really hard to ensure that all your existing apps should and hopefully will run on the M1, even if the developer themselves haven't done any kind of optimization for it yet. For example, Google Chrome and Zoom are available on the M1. Those are two apps that I use sometimes, and that works natively. They made their own app from the ground up to work with Apple Silicon. Some developers have a universal app. Another app that I use for podcasting and streaming is Loopback and Audio Hijack, and that developer has already made their app universally work with both Intel Macs and the M1 Mac. So it is just important to look up compatibility. I'll leave a link in the description where it's a community-driven website that basically reports on the compatibility of a lot of popular apps and even some not so popular apps, so hopefully that helps. I'd say the last note for buyers beware would be if you use your Intel-based Mac as a space heater, especially maybe in the wintertime, these Macs are extremely cold. This Mac, when I was streaming, me editing live in Final Cut Pro, it didn't make a sound. I don't even think I felt the fan. I didn't hear the fan. They're extremely cool and quiet. Again, chips that are extremely efficient. Whereas the Intel chips, not so much. Now you might be wondering, what is this strange stand I have for my Mac Mini? Well, the Mac Mini is already pretty small as it is, but I like to stand it up. I've had two different stands for it, but this one reminded me a lot of the design of the old Mac G4 Cube. It's not quite the same for sure, but has that similar design language to it. The new Cube, just in case anyone's gonna ask. It's my current and favorite Mac Mini stand. And the storage I got too, because people are gonna ask me, I got 512 gigabytes of solid state drive storage, which again, I have a lot of external hard drives that I can use to expand that. As for the other upgrade I got 16 gigabytes of RAM, which I do think is very important to note. If you're doing any kind of video editing, if you're doing any photo editing, major audio projects, definitely get that extra RAM. I have heard some folks get 8 gigs of RAM and that being plenty or enough for them, and that's cool, and that's fine too. I do think though, down the line, as more software updates become available, newer versions of the operating system, so whatever succeeds macOS Big Sur, and if you want everything to run as efficiently as possible, definitely consider investing in the extra RAM. Now, I was asked over on Twitter, what has my experience with Final Cut been? It's been really good, and like I said, I live streamed a live edit in Final Cut Pro, no slowdown whatsoever. On the other hand, my Intel computer, despite having an i9 and an 8-core CPU and its own 8 gigs of RAM for the GPU itself, well, it can edit in Final Cut, and it is fast, and it's powerful, and efficient, but it's also extremely hot and very loud, and there are some weird random slowdowns that occur, and this might be in part with thermal issues with both the design, having that thin chassis on the MacBook Pro. Again, M1 and Final Cut Pro are really good friends, and if you do plan to edit in Final Cut Pro, you're probably not going to be disappointed by the performance of the M1 chip, especially if you have that extra 16 gigs of RAM. No lag or slowdown with my edit itself, playback is not giving me any skipped frames, and my render and export times have been quite impressive, so I'm completely satisfied, and this has been a great upgrade from that iMac to edit in Final Cut. I was asked over on Twitter, how was the gaming experience on the M1 Max? And to that I'll say, how has the gaming experience been on the Macs ever? Look, it's quite alright. You have access to Apple Arcade. Apple's really trying to curate really strong indie titles or smaller titles into their arcade subscription service, which is fine. There's a lot of gems in there, and that's cool. If you're interested in that, most of those will run on the Mac. I think that is something that you will experience for most games that are on the market. If it is made for the Mac, it's probably made for the Intel Mac, and it's gonna probably try to run it on the M1s with Rosetta 2. It may not always work well. So if there are games that you specifically always like to play, try to do as much research as you can ahead of time to ensure that people have been able to successfully get it to run or know the workarounds to work on the M1 Max. As I mentioned before, the M1 chip is built on the foundation of the iPad and the iPhone chips. So that means that iOS and iPadOS apps and games can run natively on the M1 Mac. Keep in mind, developers do have the option to opt out of having their app available on the Mac App Store if it is an iOS or iPad app. However, there are many apps that are available. For instance, Grand Theft Auto is available. So all the Grand Theft Auto games that were on the iPhone are available on the Mac. Developers can take their apps off that app store at any point in time, or they can add it back if they feel like it runs efficiently, or they've made it natively work on the Mac. So don't expect to be running every app that's on your iPhone on your Mac, because many of them aren't going to be there. Looking at you, Instagram. If developers are able to make their apps and their games run on iPhone and iPad, they can make it run on Mac. And they have a lot more power to work with on the Mac side as well. I can definitely see it getting better. But of course, if you're a gamer, you probably know your preferred platform to game on, and that's all you really need to know and stick by. I've been asked over on Twitter and Instagram, what accessibility features am I using with the M1 Mac? What is making this Mac as accessible, if not more accessible, than previous Macs or computers? First off, I do want to mention having the Macs now, the M1s, being built on the foundation of the iPad and the iPhone processors, chips, the A-series chips, is really amazing for accessibility and consistency with software. Apple has done a really amazing job building upon the accessibility that was already offered in macOS and rebuilding some of that and a lot more on the iPhone. Things like voice control to control your entire device with just your voice, switch control, voiceover, all these amazing different ways that the operating system is designed or interacted with to accommodate various disabilities is really cool. And a lot of that has already been on the Mac, but not all of it, and not to the same degree. Now that Apple has this more consistent and coherent ecosystem for even developing, it's a lot easier for even them to make an accessibility feature on one device or one operating system and have it available on all pretty accurately and roll it out at the same time. Things like dark mode, smart invert, or speech selection were all available on iOS and iPad and a lot more full-featured than it was on the Mac for the last few years. And many users who used accessibility features thought maybe Apple's neglecting the Mac, but really it's because they were working on this. They were trying to create a system that was more consistent and easier to develop for. So if you are a user who makes use of some accessibility features, or you think you might want to, or down the line, it might benefit you, well, the M-series chips, the Macs, should give off a similar impression to what you have on your iPad or your iPhone. Time to just answer your questions, run down many of the features that I use in my Mac to, again, make the Mac as accessible as I do for my workflow. Firstly, I got to just start with it because it is my number one. It is my partner in crime, but the zoom feature. I use Zoom all the time. I've always used Zoom, and it's that universal full screen zoom that lets me take my finger or the scroll wheel and just go in as far into the screen as I need to. It's actually made a lot better and more efficient now thanks to trackpad gestures. Personally for me, I use my desktop Mac, and it's probably because I used a MacBook Pro for so long, but I use my desktop Mac with a trackpad, specifically Apple's Magic Trackpad 2. Thanks to this, I can take 3 fingers and double tap and drag my fingers and just smoothly zoom into any screen, any app, whatever it is I need to zoom into on my Mac. And I can go like super far in, like to the point where my mouse is taking up the majority of my screen. Now I know most people never have to do that or want to do that. For me, my zoom has the features full screen zoom. It also moves continuously with my cursor. That's just how I prefer to do it. There's also a zoom preview feature where if you're remaining zoomed out for most things, you can actually hit a key command, multiple keys, to then just do a real fast zoom in, and as soon as you let go, it zooms back out. That's nice for things like games that really do require the entire real estate of your screen, and then you just quickly need to zoom into a specific spot. Now people might be wondering, do I use VoiceOver? And there was a time when I would briefly turn on VoiceOver when I needed it, However, those days are pretty much over in terms of the Mac. I use VoiceOver pretty heavily and all the time on like my iPad and my iPhone, where the screen real estate is a lot smaller, and I just really cannot make out the majority of content on those screens. But on a big 4K or 5K display that's over 27 inches on a Mac, Zoom does that for me. Now, I still can't really read. Now, what I do these days is I go into the spoken content category of the accessibility settings. In spoken content, you can set multiple different ways that your Mac will read stuff to you. You can have it read alerts, so text messages that may come through, emails, calendar alerts, anything can then be read to me. Any selectable text that's on my screen, I can also have it read aloud to me, which is really cool. And now you can control the speed with the speech controller. You can make it go faster, slower, pause it, skip to the next paragraph or section, and that's just so cool. I love the speech controller, and it was on, again, iPad OS, it was on iOS, and now it's on the Mac. Another feature I'll make use of that incorporates both spoken content and Zoom is speak items under the cursor when zoomed in. What this does is, anytime that your mouse is over text or items, it will read aloud what that item is, or it will read what that text says, and it's really cool. It just, again, lets me zoom in and focus on something, but not have to read it myself, because one, that's not really possible, and two, it's really eye straining. Now, as I have a lack of pigment and my retinas are underdeveloped, I have to use a lot of display features. I make use of increased contrast, dark mode, which is really important to me, and if dark mode wasn't available, I'd sometimes be turning on invert or smart invert colors, which flips the color wheel, basically. I also make use of night shift, and this is a feature that most people are actually pretty familiar with. Fun fact, it's actually Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple's, favorite accessibility feature, something that he makes use of himself. Night shift will essentially kill off the blue light on your machine, and it will give you a warmer tone, which is, again, great, as I have photophobia and can only intake so much light. I also increase the size of my mouse, and I will oftentimes, if I lose my mouse, do the really fast shaking either with the mouse or trackpad to find it, and it will get really big for a brief moment, and then, yeah, I can also just zoom in and it'll obviously find it that way, but yeah. Another cool feature is hover text. Hover text lets you hit a key command, and whatever text that you are over will actually get really large. This works great for menus, drop-down bars, any text really that you need to basically have more accessible to read at a much larger font, and the font itself isn't large in those specific apps. This is the way around that. I also, by default, enable audio descriptions when available, so if I'm watching media, DVDs, or who has a DVD anymore? But if I rent a movie from the iTunes store, or if I'm watching something on Apple TV Plus, whatever it might be, if audio descriptions are available, it should turn those on by default. If you don't know about audio descriptions, I have videos for that, and it's basically what makes movies, cinema, all that accessible to the blind and low vision, and it's actually super beneficial if you are sighted as well, for many reasons that I, again, explain in other videos. Lastly, I actually make use of a feature that is typically categorized as for those who are hard of hearing or deaf, and that is when there is an alert on your screen or a notification, your screen actually flashes. And this is beneficial for me, because if there is an alert, I'm oftentimes zoomed in. I will miss that said alert. I can't always have it read that aloud to me, but if my computer is on like a low volume, or if I'm, just, again, for whatever reason muted, I can have my screen flash for just a brief second, that bright light, as much as I don't want to see bright lights, at least it notifies me that there is an important alert, or not so important alert, and I can check that out. Should you buy an M1 Mac? Is this the computer for you? And I think for most people, yes. However, as I've sort of mentioned before, if you rely on Boot Camp or emulating any other operating system for work or school, if you're needing Windows on your Mac, do not upgrade yet. If you need a lot more power, if you are working on like 8K video or just intense workflows, this might not be the first Apple Silicon Mac for you. These are really, the M1 was for low-powered machines like the Mac Mini and the MacBook Air and MacBook Pro entry-level ones. And although it is extremely powerful and it works for most content creators, I believe, most content creators, if you are truly a power user and you know who you are, this is, again, probably not the Mac for you. Apple, again, has said that they are working on transitioning all of their computers to Apple Silicon. All of the computers. Maybe except for the iMac Pro, because the iMac Pro just died. If you're in need of a new Mac and you just want to go for a MacBook Air or a 13-inch MacBook Pro, maybe you like the idea of running one of your favorite iPhone or iPad apps on a Mac, if it's available, this is the Mac for you. And the Apple Silicon is replacing the Intel Silicon. If you were on the fence about getting a Mac in the future and you were looking to go back to a different operating system, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should just wait off for the Apple Silicon. I pass the question off on to you. What kind of computer do you use right now? Does it fit your needs? Is it working out for you? Have you looked at maybe getting a M1 Mac? Are you waiting for something different to come out? Maybe you're waiting for the next Windows machine to come out. I'm curious what you use and why it works for you, or maybe why it doesn't work for you. I used Windows Vista for 3 years, and it did not work for me. But I tried. I really did. And I've tried Windows 7, I've tried Windows 8, and I've tried Windows 10. None of them work for me. That's okay. Android doesn't work for me, and that's okay. It may work for you, and I want to hear why. I hope that you could see something different today, and I will hear you next time. Bye.